All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to continue with our discussion of the 1920s economy. And what I want you guys to keep in mind, just like we did in class, we're going to try and compare it to the Gilded Age and kind of see similarities and differences. So today what we're going to start with is the relationship between the government and business. So if you take a look here at the electoral map of 1928, this is very indicative of the entire time period of the 1920s. The Republican Party is going to dominate. And if you notice, the only area of the country that stays Democratic is going to be the South. So if you remember during the post-Reconstruction period, I taught you the term the Solid South. So again, the South still votes Democrat, but if you look at the rest of the country, pretty much Republicans are dominating. And really the reason for this is that because the economy is thriving and they win the elections early on, like in the election of 1920 and 1924, the Republicans kind of ride this wave of economic prosperity, and they really kind of latch onto it as their policies being the reason for the economic prosperity. And so you have three Republican presidents during the 1920s. You have Warren G. Harding, you have Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover at the end, and he kind of carries into the 1930s. But basically, three Republican presidents. And really, what you see here is the formation of the modern ideology of the Republican Party as far as economics and what we would refer to as conservatism in the Republican Party. I think this is important. We've been talking about the Republicans and the Democrats for a while. They've existed since for the Democrats from the 1820s, 1830s, for the Republicans from the 1860s. And really, hopefully you've noticed that both parties are not exactly what they are today. But this is when you start to see the Republican Party turn into a party that we would recognize as believing in the same things that the Republican Party believes in now. Same thing with the Democrats. So what you're going to start to see, I think this quote from Calvin Coolidge gives you an idea of what you start to see form as the Republican economic ideology. He says, the government can supply no substitute for enterprise. Another quote from Coolidge is that the business of government is business. And basically what they're trying to say here is that it's better to have private enterprise run their businesses on their own, and have government kind of almost be like a partner for business and work with business to the best of their ability. And if they do that, business is going to prosper and it's going to do well. So comparing this to our Gilded Age philosophy that was pretty prominent, which is laissez-faire, you can kind of see a little bit of a difference here. It's not just hands-off. It's kind of trying to limit the government's role in business because they feel like private enterprise can do it better, but the government's also supposed to create policies that facilitate and help business to prosper and to do better. So it's kind of a hand-in-hand ideology. So it's similar to the Gilded Age, because the Gilded Age, they did that as well. They facilitated railroad building, and they facilitated what they saw as expansion of manufacturing. So in some ways it's laissez-faire, and in some ways it's not laissez-faire. Now, the ideology that becomes prominent in the Republican Party in the 1920s, and this stays with us in the Republican Party for a very long time, is a philosophy that's espoused by a guy named Andrew Mellon. And really this becomes like the bedrock of the conservative economic philosophy and ideology. So his big idea is that it's good for the economy if you give tax cuts to the wealthy. And why he believes this is that if you give tax cuts to the wealthy are going to take their money and they're going to invest it in their businesses or other people's businesses, which is going to give those businesses more capital and allow them to expand, provide more jobs, and ultimately expand the economy. So that's the idea. And then if you look at the other side, this cartoon, the political cartoon, is trying to show you the other aspect that Mellon believed would happen, is that if you give tax cuts to the wealth is eventually going to trickle down. They call it trickle down. Critics call it trickle down economics. That it'll eventually reach the lower classes, the working class and the poorer class, because wealthy people, if they're able to expand their business, they might raise salaries, they might expand jobs, and kind of help to facilitate growth in the economy. Now, you're going to see this idea revisited in our class. So we're going to get up to this in our class kind of towards the end of the year with Ronald Reagan. And he calls it supply side economics, but it's basically the same idea that Andrew Mellon came up with in the 1920s and that our Republican presidents of the 20s believe in, that helping the wealthy actually helps the country as a whole. And this idea sparks tons of criticism now. It sparked criticism in the 20s and the 80s because it's controversial, because it looks like you're helping out the wealthy. Now, to analyze this a little bit, does it actually work? The answer is yes and no. In one way, it does work. It will expand. History tells us in the 20s it expanded the economy, it helped businesses to grow. In the 80s, when Reagan institutes it, it helps businesses to grow and to expand the economy. The thing that doesn't follow along is the second aspect, the trickling down to the poor. Really, in both cases, in the 20s, you see a wealth gap develop, greater wealth gap. Same thing in the 80s. The gap between the rich and the poor is gonna grow. And so, in certain ways, the philosophy works, and in certain ways, the philosophy does not work. So it depends on really what you're trying to achieve in your economic policy. But the Republicans of the 20s, they start to infuse this into their economic policies. Now, the other thing that's going on here in the 20s is widespread deregulation of business. So you saw during the progressive era this real increase in regulating the economy and regulating business practices. And so you saw this maybe with like the Pure Food and Drug Act and other acts similar to that that kind of regulated the economy or regulated businesses and business practices. During the 20s, you're going to see a movement to not get rid of regulation totally, but to deregulate, to try and give as minimal amount of regulations as possible for business. And the philosophy is that with minimal regulation, it allows business to have more freedom to practice good policies and to help their business to expand. If you put too many rules and regulation on business, it hampers what they're able to do and how they're able to do it. So again, another philosophy. And remember in your mind, compare this to the Gilded Age. It's similar, except that the Gilded Age kind of had almost a total lack of regulation. And so it's kind of like an in-between stage, I think, between the progressives and the Gilded Age policies. Because some of the progressive policies carry over into the 20s. It's not like they're gone. There's some of the regulation is still there. Okay, now the second big thing that's happening economically in the 20s is that you have widespread consumerism. So a new ideology that's out there. And you guys, as citizens of America in 2014, 2015, you guys, this is your culture. You understand consumerism. Although you might not be able to define it, this belief that exactly what consumerism is trying to get people to buy things that they don't necessarily need, but that they want. So it's kind of an economy that's fueled off of buying products that are non-essentials. And so this becomes part of the 1920s culture, is buying for the sake of buying products that, maybe like household products that you might not need, but you might want. And so this is what we would call consumer culture, buying to buy, or buying because you have a desire for something. And the 20s is going to kind of see exponential growth in this. And really it kind of goes hand in hand with new advertising that's out there in the 20s. So you can see some of the print advertising that they had that would end up in newspapers and magazines, and try and preach to people that consumerism and buying because you want something is a good thing. And it will reach people through the radio. And you have to understand, this is definitely a new philosophy in America, this idea of buying just because you want something, and that being acceptable and that being good. That runs contrary to traditional, American beliefs in a very big way. Americans were always big on saving and buying things that are necessities. Think of the religious values that the country was founded upon. This is kind of very much the opposite of what a lot of early Americans would have believed in. But this starts to become part of the culture. And so you could just see some of the ads. These I kind of thought were interesting ads from the 20s. You could kind of see like how popular culture has changed. This is all about gaining weight, and they're trying to get people to gain weight because that's considered more attractive and a better, healthier lifestyle. And these are just some companies that you guys might be familiar with, like Coca-Cola and Wrigley's Gum. And so, like this advertising is out there, getting people to buy, just simply to buy products. And a lot of these things are targeted towards women, because you have a lot of new household products that are being pushed on the consumer. You have electric irons, you have toasters. The invention of electricity and the prominence of electricity in the household for middle class Americans starts to facilitate this push to kind of get new appliances, new household items. And so, again, a lot of this stuff is geared towards women who are seen as the primary homemaker in American society. Now, the second issue with all of this consumerism is that it goes hand in hand with another pretty new idea, not brand new, but a pretty new idea in American history of allowing people to buy things on credit. And so what happens here is that, let's just say, for example, you wanted to buy a new iron, new electric iron, but you didn't have the money to purchase it. What they would allow, let's say, the department store like a Woolworths, who was a national chain department store in the era. What they would allow you to do is to buy the product on credit. So you get the product immediately, like immediate gratification, and then you pay off, hopefully, the product in installments with interest. Now, there are major problems with this, and one of the big problems is that uh, in certain ways, it's kind of almost like a fake economy. People are buying things with money that they don't really have, and it kind of facilitates growth in companies. But the truth is that real money is not really being exchanged. And if you can never pay off your product, if you default on your credit, the economy seems like it's expanding, but it's not really not expanding. And so what this is going to happen in the 20s is you have a lot of credit buying, and this creates what we're going to call a bubble in the 1920s economy. And eventually, it gets to the point where the bubble is going to pop, and kind of the underlying flaws of the economy are going to kind of show through. And so this becomes a problem later in the 1920s. But you still deal with some of the problems now, and even recently when they talked about, like in the problems we had in 2008 and 2009, they talked about the housing bubble of people buying on huge mortgages with really low interest rates. It's kind of a similar problem, just in a different area that America was dealing with. Now, what you also see growing at the time is people investing in the stock market. So this is not everybody. We're talking about mostly middle class to upper class people who would invest in the stock market. Um, but a similar problem that you see as far as credit is happening here in stocks. People are investing in companies, and what's happening is it's making the company's stock rise tremendously, which makes the company appear to be very prosperous and makes the company appear to be doing really well. When in fact, in reality, it might not be doing as well as it seems on paper. And what's added into that is at the time they also allowed people to buy stocks on credit. And what they called that was buying a stock on margin. And if you buy a stock on margin, you were allowed to put down as little as 10% of the worth of the stock into purchasing it, meaning 90% was borrowed. Again, it's the same thing as when you buy a product on credit. It's making the stock artificially increase when real money is not being invested into the stock. It's all credit-based money, and this was common during the 1920s. So you have kind of a facilitation of problems developing in the 1920s based off of consumer culture, credit, and kind of deregulation that's widespread. All right, so we're going to pick up with culture of the